Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at applying the principles of user experience design to the classroom.
Ooh, that's interesting.
It's not something you hear every day, right?
Not really.
The article we're going to be looking at for this deep dive is The Classroom as User Experience, Teaching with Intention, Not Tradition by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD.
Okay.
Now, Hoerricks has a really fascinating background. They were a forensic science teacher.
Wow.
They identify as a Gestalt language processor and are also autistic.
That's a really unique set of experiences.
Right. I mean, just think about it.
Yeah.
Analyzing evidence in forensics that requires a meticulous attention to detail, right?
Right.
And the ability to see patterns and connections, and all those skills seem super relevant when you think about how complex a classroom can be.
I see that. Yeah. It's like you need to understand how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, exactly. So the big question that we're going to be exploring today is how can we design classrooms that actually prioritize the student's experience? So Horace actually argues that we should be designing instruction for the student with the most complex needs. If the classroom works for that student, it'll work for everybody.
Makes sense.
Right. It's kind of like universal design for learning, but like a step further.
Yeah, push it a little bit.
Yeah. And what's really cool is that Hoerricks isn't just talking about this theoretically. They actually put this into practice in their own teaching.
Okay.
And the results are amazing.
Well, now I have to know what happened.
Okay, so Hoerricks taught Algebra the Second, and the year before they started doing this, almost all of the IEP students failed the class.
Oh, wow.
But after Hoerricks redesigned the classroom with this student-centered approach, all of the IEP students passed.
Wow, that's a huge improvement.
Right.
So how did they do that? What did they actually change?
So one thing was something called chunking and checking.
Okay.
Hoerricks realized that their tendency to infodump was actually overwhelming for students.
Info dumping.
Yeah, and they actually relate that to being autistic.
Oh, interesting.
So they broke down this complex information into smaller chunks, more manageable pieces, and used visuals and metaphors and analogies.
So they made it more interactive.
Yeah, and it's not just about how they delivered the information.
Okay.
They also really wanted to create a safe space for students to ask questions, if they were struggling.
Yeah.
They even had students asking things like, can you translate this into girl math?
Oh, that's great.
Hoerricks also had this really interesting analogy.
Oh.
They compared their teaching style to an offensive lineman in football.
Okay, I don't see the connection yet.
So they said they're not the star player, scoring the touchdowns,
Okay.
but they are clearing the path for their students to shine.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, they're providing support and removing those barriers and empowering students to take charge of their learning.
So they're a facilitator.
Exactly.
And did it work?
Yeah, Hoerricks saw a huge increase in engagement.
Yeah.
The students really seemed to feel safe and like they belonged in the classroom.
It's wonderful.
And they were willing to ask for help.
That's huge.
And all of that just came from this idea of thinking about the classroom like a user experience, like you would design a website.
It makes me wonder why more people aren't doing this.
Yeah, I know, right?
So I'm really interested to hear more about how their background in forensics played into all of this.
Yeah, me too. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about in the next part of the deep dive.
So forensics and classroom design, they seem like totally different things.
Yeah, but Hoerricks actually makes a really strong case for how their forensic background really shaped how they think about teaching.
I'm curious, how does that work?
So Hoerricks talks about how in forensics, they had to tailor instructions for these forensic analysts
Okay.
based on their specific roles and the cases that they were working on.
Yeah.
They couldn't just dump all this information on them and expect them to just figure it out.
Right, that makes sense.
And Hoerricks realized that the same thing is true for teaching. Just like those forensic analysts need information that's, relevant to their work.
Yeah.
Students need learning experiences that connect to their interests and, their own lives.
So it's about finding that connection that makes it stick.
Yeah, exactly. Hoerricks actually even uses the word hooks in the article. They talk about how important it is to present information in a way that grabs the student's attention, makes them want to learn more.
It's like you're telling a story.
Yeah. And it makes me think about how Hoerricks also talks a lot about using visuals and metaphors. They used to make these really detailed crime scene diagrams. And they realized that visuals could make these complex ideas so much easier to understand.
Right, especially for visual learners.
Yeah. So they started using those same principles when they were teaching, even in algebra.
Okay, so using visuals helped the students understand abstract concepts.
Yeah, exactly. And this approach actually seemed to really help the students collaborate better, too.
Interesting how so.
Hoerricks started to see students really taking charge in discussions,
Ah.
explaining stuff to each other and even like disagreeing with each other.
Oh, wow. So they weren't just passively listening anymore.
No, they were totally engaged. And not only that, they were actually more willing to ask for help when they were struggling.
That's a big deal.
Huh.
For some students, it can be hard to admit that they need help.
Right. Hoerricks had students coming up to them after class or like during office hours saying, I don't get it. Can you explain it to me a different way?
That's great that they felt comfortable doing that.
Yeah, and all of this really helped to create a stronger sense of belonging in the classroom, too.
Yeah.
Students started seeing each other as like resources, people they could learn from and work with.
Yeah, instead of just competition.
Exactly. And it all goes back to this idea of thinking about the classroom like a user experience.
Right. Designing it with the student in mind.
It's fascinating how Hoerricks took all these different ideas, from forensics, from user experience design, and brought them together.
Yeah, it's really unique.
And what's really inspiring is that this shows us that we can all do this, whether we're teachers or parents or just people who want to share what we know with others.
Yeah, make it easier for others to learn.
So we've talked about Hoerricks' story, their approach, and the amazing things they saw in their classroom. But I'm wondering, how do we take these big ideas and turn them into something we can actually do?
Right. What are the actual techniques?
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be diving into in the next part of the deep dive. Okay, so we've talked about Jaime Hoerricks' unique journey and how their background in forensics really informs how they approach teaching.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But let's get practical here.
Yeah.
What are the, actual techniques that they use to make this happen in the classroom?
Well, what's interesting is that Hoerricks doesn't really give like a strict set of rules. It's more of a flexible kind of framework, adapts to the students.
Yeah.
And I think that forensic background probably plays a role in that, don't you think?
Oh, totally. Hoerricks really emphasizes starting with the student's needs and then working backward,
Okay.
like designing the instruction around those needs.
I see.
It's almost like a detective solving a case,
Right. You got to gather all the clues.
Yeah,
Understand the situation, and then figure out what the solution is.
exactly. And it really shows how important it is to observe and analyze, which are like key skills in both forensics and teaching.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about some of the specific things Hoerricks does.
Okay.
They talk a lot about universal design for learning, or UDL.
Yeah.
For people who might not know, could you give us a quick overview of what that is?
So UDL is basically about creating learning experiences that work for everyone,
Okay.
no matter their background or how they learn best.
Got it.
So it's about offering different ways to engage with the material, different ways to present information,
Right.
and different ways for students to show what they know.
So it's not about like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, exactly.
It's about options and flexibility.
Yeah. And Hoerricks talks about how being a Gestalt language processor, really shapes how they think about UDL.
Okay.
They get that, everyone processes information differently,
Yeah.
and that you can't just have this one-size-fits-all approach.
Makes sense.
Hoerricks also talks about scaffolding as a really important strategy.
Right. Can you remind us what that is again?
Scaffolding is all about giving students structured support,
Hmm.
as they learn new things.
Mm-hmm.
Like those temporary supports that they put up around a building when they're constructing it.
Right.
Like as the building gets stronger, you can take those supports away.
So in a classroom, it might be like breaking down a big task into smaller steps,
Yeah,
or giving them visuals and examples to help them understand.
exactly. And Hoerricks actually connects this idea of scaffolding to their own experience with, autistic info dumping.
Hmm.
They found that breaking information into smaller chunks and using visuals made it easier for them to learn. So they use that same approach when they teach.
That's a great point. Understanding how you learn best can really help you be a better teacher.
Absolutely. Another thing that Hoerricks talks about is real-time responsiveness.
Oh, yeah. What was that again?
So it's basically about being really tuned in to what your students need and like adjusting how you're teaching based on that.
Okay.
It's about making it okay for students to say, hey, I don't get this.
Right. Like that student who asked for girl math.
Yes, exactly. Hoerricks was able to just like switch gears right there and explain it in a way that made sense for that student.
That's awesome.
It's about being flexible, adaptable,
Yeah.
and responding to those moments when a student is like, aha, I get it, or when they're just totally lost.
Hmm.
And it's also about realizing that teaching is a learning process for everyone involved.
For the teacher, too.
Exactly.
It seems like this idea of real-time responsiveness kind of fits with Hoerricks' forensic background, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, a good detective has to be able to change their approach, when they find new evidence or have new ideas. And that same kind of flexibility is so important for teachers, too.
Absolutely. Especially if you want to create a learning environment where everyone feels included and supported.
Okay, so we've got universal design for learning scaffolding and real-time responsiveness. Those are like the key tools for Hoerricks.
Yeah.
But how do those things actually work together to create that sense of inclusivity and belonging that we talked about?
So when you combine all of those things, you create a classroom where students feel like they're seen and heard and valued.
Yeah.
They feel like they can learn in a way that works for them. Yeah. They feel comfortable asking questions, you know, taking risks and working with each other.
It's not just about the academics, then.
It's about building a community.
Yeah, where everyone supports each other.
Exactly.
It sounds like Hoerricks created a classroom where everyone has a chance to shine.
Yeah, just like that offensive lineman analogy.
Right.
And it's a good reminder that teaching inclusively isn't about just checking boxes.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that every student feels like they belong and that they can succeed.
This has been such a great deep dive.
Yeah,
I think what's really stuck with me is that we can all learn from Hoerricks' approach.
absolutely.
Whether we're teachers or parents or mentors or just, people who love to learn.
Right.
There's so much we can take away from this.
Yeah.
We can be more intentional about designing experiences that are inclusive and empowering for everyone.
I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
As you go about your day today, think about how you can apply some of these principles to your own life.
Hmm.
How can you be more responsive to the needs of others? How can you make the spaces you're in more inclusive and supportive, for learning and growth?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into Jaime Hoerricks' amazing approach to creating inclusive classrooms.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.